Rolling. So Eric, you should have the presenter role there so you can share your platform.
Yeah, sounds good. I appreciate the opportunity, and thanks again for the invite and being able to share kind of one of my passions on the Mississippi River. And not just Mississippi, but I guess rivers in general. While I pull up the presentation here.
I was reading a little bit. We have 152 lakes, is it, Minnesota, and then 3 major river systems that are pretty good bass fisheries, right?
There's quite a few, yeah. So we'll be covering some of that. So
Awesome.
what I kind of titled this is everything you ever wanted to know about smallmouth bass and river fishing. Well, almost, because I don't claim to know everything, but as a fisheries biologist and stuff, I feel like I have a little bit more of an insight maybe to how to catch some fish, or at least how they should be anyway. I've been doing this now for 24 years in Minnesota, and prior to that, 5 years in Texas and another 3 years in Colorado, a lot of which were on river type systems and reservoir systems. So I guess I feel like I'm a little familiar with how to at least understand what's going on with smallmouth bass in rivers in particular. So one of the things that I've found, I gotta see if we can get in advance here. There we go. Is just trying to understand the critter, right? So, you know, we're going to try and go a little bit about distribution, the basic facts, the growth, understanding habitat use, and then obviously the fishing tips and lures to use, equipment, etc. So, just understanding that it's a member of the sunfish family, right? So we have to acknowledge the fact that it's got spiny fins, it's got soft rayed fins, it feeds on a variety of critters. Smallmouth bass really like crayfish. I mean, it's kind of one of their staple food items. And they also eat fish and minnows, as well as other invertebrates like leeches and/or other bugs found in the water column and under rocks and stuff in the river systems. Um, in Minnesota, we're pretty fortunate. We have 152 lakes statewide that have smallmouth bass in them as of right now. And that actually is something that has been increasing since the first days when we started sampling them here in Minnesota. Some of that is natural distribution by connected river systems. Some of that probably is because of angler introductions, because we certainly have not stocked them in many places. There's been a few, but not too many. But we do have numerous rivers in the state that also have smallmouth bass in them, and that's kind of why we're here today, is to talk about that. So just to kind of give you an idea of what the average length and weight is, and this is from actually taking the inner ear stones from fish. Yes, we had to sacrifice a few fish to do this, but the data is important to get the length, the weight, and then the overall age for each fish. And just to kind of make you realize that these fish do grow fairly old, and the oldest recorded in Minnesota is around 26 years of age. And then fish over 20 inches are fairly rare. Certainly, the lakes have a potential to produce larger fish in general, but the rivers, it's pretty tough. They live in a pretty tough environment. So just keep in mind that a long fish is generally a pretty old fish, at least 15 years of age. So something to keep in mind. So one of the things I was fortunate enough to be involved with was a few years back, I got involved with a telemetry study when I was still at the Sauk Rapids office. And we implanted 30 fish in 6 separate areas, released within about a mile and a half or so of or mile of their capture site. And they were tagged, as you can kind of see in the photos there. And we implanted them, and then I monitor them for an entire year, following them around at least on a every other day basis, and then during the wintertime it was separated out by a week. So the reason I bring this up is this is a way to learn a little bit more about fish, and I thought it was really valuable for me as an angler personally to see what these fish actually do during other times of the year, what's their home range like and stuff. So I thought I'd present some of these results to try and help understand a little bit about the habitat and the behavior of these fish in river systems, because it is different than lakes. So we had quite a few locations. Overall average depth of 3.9 feet, 4.7 in the winter, and then 3.1 feet in the summer. Most people are like, what? Just 4.7 feet average depth? Well, there was a few fish that actually had areas where they wintered that were only a few feet deep. So a little bit different than most people think of. The common substrates, cobble and sand. Well, that's not any surprise to anybody that angles for smallmouth bass, that they like rocks in general. So that's certainly true. Migration, this is the big kind of surprise to a lot of folks, is that fish migrate quite a bit. And this is one of the reasons that we're always pushing for, having open passages for fish to be able to migrate and move. And is that, these smallmouth bass in this stretch of river, which is between St. Cloud and Anoka, basically, moved 16.25 miles average, right? And then 15 miles downstream to winter. So sometimes they moved as much as 18 miles upstream just to go to spawn. So if you think about the energy they expend to go upstream when the current is flowing pretty high, just to go lay eggs and guard the nests and do their thing to make young of the year appear the next year, it's pretty amazing. Not to mention that it's quite a feat when you try and find the fish that moved up to a mile or two in a day. So something else. So this is kind of a summary of the habitat types used. And when I say habitat type, it's the eddies and pools were mostly used, and then runs. So just so we're clear on the language, a pool is obviously a deeper area that doesn't have much current. A run is an area where it's just a straight flat flow and doesn't have any riffles or whatever in it. And then an eddy is an area that might have a back current. So in other words, it's also like a pool, but it's an area where it might be a small spot where there's not as much current. So if you notice that, when you look at the habitat types used, obviously during the winter in January through March, basically, the pools are mostly used. On the other hand, as the summer progresses in, May, June, July, you get runs and or eddies that are used more often. So just something to think about when you're angling. Overhead covered, so depth, woody debris, the morning and evening shade and rock are most common, and this has kind of changed throughout the year. Again, January through March or through the middle there, and obviously depth was a little bit more important because they're mostly in those larger pools. Peaks in movement. This is just understanding that they have a fall migration and a spring migration, and the spring migration occurs right during the time when the temperatures increase. So this 12 degrees Celsius amounts to around 54, 55 degrees right in that area. And so October and May were the big peak months of movement, and this is just one way to kind of show that. And then I just thought I'd kind of show you a couple of the actual graphs or graphics that we came up with for individual fish. And this one in particular was on a single bend or whatever. And when we look at hectares, it's actually, there's 2.5 acres for each hectare. So basically we're looking at 12 acres of a basic home range area. This particular fish also, that one dot that's up there on land is no joke. That was actually a little tributary stream near a golf course that it used. So it was kind of interesting to see that. But nonetheless, they have a small home range during most of the year. That blue, the darker blue, is their common, most tight area home range that's found during the summer. That particular fish, if you see it, lived down in Clearwater during the summer and then made its way up to the spawning locations in the spring, went back down to the areas in the summer down by Clearwater, and then went back up to its winter home range in St. Cloud. So all those things are kind of shockers to most people, that these fish move around that much in an area that they might have fished or been on for a long time. Again, this is just another example of a particular fish down near the XL Energy plant, Monticello area. Fish hung out in a more or less a run area, but these were mostly eddies along both sides. And it was kind of interesting to see this fish because that was the type of habitat it hung out in. And it also went all the way up to St. Cloud just to spawn. So again, this is one of those sort of shockers. People didn't realize that, oh, I hung out there during the summertime, must be this is a local fish. Well, they move quite a bit. And that's the kind of the long-term message here. And this is the one that was pretty special because I actually spotted this fish. That is him right next to that log in the picture up on the upper right there. And I noticed that this male got in there and he actually had a successful nest and produced young of the year. There's some black sort of dots that you see there, and those are actually what we call black fry or the young of the year smallmouth bass. So really kind of cool. There's another example, just kind of an overall picture showing some of the dots that where this fish was found, and what corresponded to wintertime movements, is summertime movements, and this is an area called Big Bend, right in the Mississippi River down by Clearwater. So again, kind of a cool to see the fish in one day that we actually had a high flow event, not much different than what we've had just recently. And I actually tracked this fish out into a field, into a pasture area, because that's where he was feeding. So it was kind of cool to see that. We also did all day movements, right? So this is a way that we could track them every couple hours, and then tried to see what do they do during the entire day? How much movement is there in a given day? Well, this kind of gives you an idea that we have, some areas that are fairly large and then some that are fairly small. And it really just depends on the habitat type that's available and apparently what food is available at the same time. So the daily movements are kind of summarized this way, is that we had these groups of fish. So there's 5 fish in each group. So Becker, Clearwater, Monticello, St. Cloud, Dayton, Elk River, and overall. So you look at the ones around St. Cloud, they moved quite a bit on a daily basis. The ones around Elk River didn't move quite so much. Similarly around Clearwater, they didn't move so much on a daily basis or during the entire day. But it is kind of indicative that the fish do move during a day, and most of the time it was to riffle areas in the morning to feed or in the evening to feed, and then they'd usually get back off into those eddies or pools or runs even during the midday. So the migration is kind of the biggest thing that we came up with on this deal, and realized that they are very mobile. They have a mean annual range of about 8.5 miles, and anywhere between 1.25 miles to 34.2 miles is their annual range. So long migrations during spring and fall to specific areas, they up to 18.5 miles or so. Seasonal migrations represented the largest portion of total annual movement, and that's obviously a no-brainer when you saw some of those pictures. Most smallmouth bass use eddies, pools, and runs, but this varied seasonally. Most spawn near islands and backwaters and large eddies. And if you think about it, it makes sense. The young fry are very vulnerable, so they can't easily get away from the current, whereas other fish species can tolerate some of that. They need areas with little current for wintering. However, that's not always deep. And as I mentioned, we had some wintering smallmouth bass that were in less than 1.5 feet of water or so. They move great distances in a short time, up to 1.5 kilometers per day, about a mile or so in a given day. So that's impressive. Even when they're going upstream, they can move that fast. So how does all this stuff that I just talked about help you catch river smallmouth bass? Well, first of all, we have to think about the habitat. That's something that a lot of people take for granted, I believe, is that they don't just think about where they're casting to and how a fish might be positioned, because these fish are constantly fighting to stay alive, right? And not waste so much energy, because they're battling what they just ate, being with what they are trying to do just to be able to stay in a given spot. So if we think about the fact that they have a certain habitat that they need to not use so much energy during the year, that's really important. So it also is important to realize that we have to present the baits in a way that they're accustomed to. So they sit in a type of habitat, and which direction is that bait or that prey item maybe moving down to them, or is it moving away from them? So these are kind of things that we need to think about a little bit. And then one of the things is that I guess I would offer is that you cover some water and then slow down when you figure something out. So this is kind of one of the techniques that I've used and been fairly successful with on the river systems. I hit the most likely habitat types, those little eddies, those little pockets or whatever, when it's not an early morning type operation that we're catching fish in the midday. That's the ideal area to hit. So the cover, the heavier covers, the little bit deeper stuff during the midday, and then in the mornings and evenings, I kind of focus on some of those shallow feeding areas. So those riffle areas, they're ideal. So if we put that into practice here, looking at this map, this is just an example of up by the Excel Energy plant. And these blue spots are all where the fish was found, or fish in that area were found. And if you note, these are just some highlighted areas that I picked out real quickly. There's some riffles, there's some eddies, and then down in the right-hand corner towards the power plant area there is also several pools. All right, so it's not uncommon to see these fish moving between these different habitat types during a given day. But what's most interesting is that these eddies And the pool areas definitely, and the run areas actually do have a tendency to hold a few more of the fish. So that's how we kind of apply all this habitat knowledge that we gain by reading studies and or paying attention to telemetry work. Is it's actually kind of interesting in my my mind as a fish geek, I guess. So what baits do you use? Well, I prefer to use search baits to start with, right? So search baits would include something like a walking style topwater bait. As long as it's warm enough water, say over 60 some odd degrees, the topwater bait is an ideal way to try and see what is going to maybe bite. And if they don't right away, you can do something with a follow-up bait, some kind of soft plastic. Poppers are a great way to kind of do some searching. I like to use the ones that are kind of pointed to right in the middle there. Those are called swim jigs. And basically what they are is just a cone-shaped head on a jig, and then I tie the skirts on and then put a trailer on it, like those boot tail type fish paddle tail arrangements, or something like a spinnerbait. All those will work for sure. And they're a great way to cover a bunch of water and see what might be hitting or whatever, and then be able to hopefully slow down and focus on something a little bit different. Along with that, um, we have reaction baits, right? So in this case, we're talking about stuff like crankbaits and a chatterbait or a bladed jig, as a lot of people call them now. Similarly, with that buzz bait over on the upper left and the whopper plopper, that's a chopping style prop bait on topwater. Both of those are great for reaction strikes. I mean, yes, you could argue that the spinner bait is also a reaction strike type bait, but it it definitely covers a lot of water for you as well. And some of these do at the same time. Like the bladed jig is a great way to cover a bunch of water. The darker colors seem to do better in dirty water. Lighter colors seem to do better in clear water. And that's true for the swim jigs as well as the buzz baits and all. So crankbaits, I'm not a big crankbait fisherman, but they can be very effective. The problem becomes that if we have too much vegetation in the river in certain sections that I happen to fish, that is pretty common. And they become sort of ineffective once you get some vegetation on there. So the weedless options, or at least lower weed potential options, tend to do a little bit better. So now we've gotten onto a couple bites and we figure out, hey, they're behind logs or they're on a drop off or they're near an eddy that has a drop off or something like that. Well, then you can slow down. So the classic example is that one on the very top, and that's called a stickworm or a senko. And when you when we talk about those, I only have a few basic colors that I use. I don't get in all the fancy colors. And honestly, for river fish, they have very little time to think about what the color is. You're not presenting it in this ultra clear water environment typically. They're thinking about feeding more than they are about, what the bait looks like. Certainly high pressure situations could change that, but my basic colors are this black and blue, brown with a chartreuse, and then brown and white, and then white. Right. So those are some common colors that I've been very effective with on the river. And typically I'll work them wacky rig. So the one up on the top kind of shows the O-ring holding the hook. I usually put the hook in at about a 45-degree angle to try and make sure that it doesn't come out so easily. But basically that allows even if the fish shakes, the worm slides up the line, and rather than pitching it and getting rid of it, you hang on to the worm a little bit longer. So moving on, we're looking at the next couple down. Those are basically called Ned rig, right, or a jig worm, and those could be either used with a straight tail worm, like just even taking a portion of a stick worm or a senko and sliding it onto a jig head plane like that. It's the stupidest looking thing, I realize it, but it is actually one of the most effective baits that's hit the market in a long time for a variety of species too. Oftentimes I'll even catch walleye while I'm fishing with a Ned rig right there, and those colors are kind of my go-to. Browns, even the purple, the black and blue, those combinations tend to work really well. You can also use just a plain old curly tail grub in the same kind of color combinations, and they're all very effective. And then finally, the jig and craw and tubes are some slower options yet, a little bit more weedless. I like to rig my tubes what they call Texas style with an internal weight, and that allows you to kind of pitch it into some cover that might be a little bit thicker than the average, and you're not going to get away with that on a stickworm or a senko rigged wacky style, as they call it, up on the top there. So these allow you to get in some of that woody cover that the fish like to hang out in the middle of the day, and it's an easy way to keep them weedless as well. What about the rods, the reels, and the line? Well, honestly, it is a personal preference, but one thing I guess I would offer is that use a heavy enough combination to pull fish out of cover quickly. And the reason I say that, I've had several people that have fished along with me for the first time, and they're fishing with 8-pound test. Well, a fish that's of decent size, 16, 18-inch smallmouth bass can pull much harder than 8-pound test is capable of pulling. Okay, so they can break that line fairly easily. And I think one of the things that it's our responsibility, I suppose, to be able to get that fish in quickly and then release it if you want to, but basically trying to get it out of the cover as quickly as you can. So to do that, I would suggest using medium to medium heavy type rods for both spinning and or bait casting gear. A lot of people like to use a lot of light action rods, and I'm not against that per se, but it's just something that if I want to be effective, I need to be able to, one, cast the bait effectively and accurately, and two, be able to get that fish out of the cover with whatever type of arrangement I'm using. For spinning gear, I'm typically using 10 to 15-pound line as my main line. And that's just because it casts a lot easier. I tend to use braid for almost everything. For bait casting, a 30-pound minimum is what I would suggest. And that's only because you're going to be pitching a little bit heavier lures. You might be in the cover and stuff. And I think it might be a good idea to at least offer the minimum amount of 30 pounds. And then, as I mentioned, I would suggest braided line only because it's really tough. It's very skinny, so it casts a lot easier, and it lasts a long time. And you can swap sides on it, and be able to gain more use out of it during one fishing season. So it's pretty slick in that way. And if you have an ultra clear environment, you can always tie on a fluorocarbon leader to kind of cover stuff up. So other than that, the fishing for smallmouth and stuff, it can be dependent upon the flows. So like the higher the flow, the more they're going to be out towards the outsides. The lower the flow, they can be throughout the entire channel. Something else that kind of came up in the study was that during the month of August in particular, they would find center channel habitat versus during the rest of the years, mostly along the sides of the channel. So interesting little tidbit and something that can hopefully help you pick up a few smallmouth bass or a few more smallmouth bass from river systems. But with that, I'd love to handle any other questions and measure those fish accurately, like that that picture on the board on the bottom. That's how you measure a fish. So make sure when you're measuring them and you say you've got a 24-incher, make sure it actually is legit on there. That way we can kind of verify and talk the same language. But other than that, I'd be glad to take some questions.
You don't promote measuring like Grandpa used to do. It was at least 2.5 feet.
Yeah, no, that's okay. All right, so I can quit sharing.
So, yeah, that was great. And you were
Okay.
talking a lot about braided line. We had this discussion up in Elia's doing an event up there at the vets camp. And what's your favorite go-to knot on braided line?
I almost always use a Palomar knot. That's just kind of my go-to, only because it's easy and I can tie it in the dark. I can tie it even when I need glasses now, right? So I can tie it without my glasses, and it's very effective, and it doesn't slip, and it also doesn't hurt fluorocarbon line as well. So that's good. Fluorocarbon, if you heat it up too much, it can pop early, and that's one thing that you have to be aware of anyway. So.
Yep, it's a good. I like to point that out. A lot of people ask about knots. So
Yeah.
Ed had a couple of great questions in here,
Sure.
and one of them was, is there any lake smallmouth? Which I think we talked a little bit about. There's a lot of lake smallmouth, or they're only a river fish. But what's a couple of the key differences? There's a lot of guys around the metro area down here that fish bass in local lakes.
Sure.
What's a little bit a different tactic that you would take if you were lake fishing versus river fishing, or you just covered?
Lake versus rivers. Wow. Well, so river fishing to me is kind of it's a luxury, right? Because you do have to have a little bit specialized gear. Like I personally have a jet boat that I fish out of, and it's been worth it for me. But I fish a lot of rivers. You don't necessarily need that with a lake. You could easily fish with a kayak out of both type systems, right? But you could probably be a little bit more effective in a lake just from a positioning standpoint. As far as presentation and style of fishing that you might want to do in a lake, I guess I would suggest you'd probably get up really early to try and be there the crack of dawn, especially during the summertime, to try and use some topwater baits or whatever, and get on some points or whatever. In a river system, I usually don't even bother going first thing in the morning, right? I mean, most of the time we'll get out there 8:30, 9 o'clock or whatever, and the fish will still be very active and feeding throughout the mid morning or whatever. So it is a different ball game. The other piece is that I can't fish very late into the night because the bug hatches are so bad that if I have to navigate back on plane at all, I end up with bugs in the teeth, and that's not a real fun thing. So, but not to mention it's also a safety issue. I mean, you don't want to be navigating when it's really dark and some rocky habitat. So there's a few differences for sure. There's a lot of lakes in Minnesota that have smallmouths. Like I mentioned, 152 lakes in Minnesota. Obviously, some of the bigger ones like Mille Lacs, but we even have a couple in our area: Big Birch, Little Birch, Lake Alexander. There's a few others that actually have them. Lock Lake down near right off of 94 there. I mean, there's a bunch of lakes around the area that have them. You don't necessarily have to fish the rivers, but what's kind of neat is that I don't see very many people. So at least not yet. So
Maybe after this show.
I was just gonna say maybe until after the talk, right? But
so, Russell asked about the stickworm and the Ned rigs that you were showing earlier. Do you leave the barb of the hook exposed or embedded?
with the wacky rig, it's almost always, you can buy specialized hooks with a weed guard on them, and that is helpful. But I find that those usually wear out fairly quickly, and I use my casting, and I try to work the bait, effectively away from cover, so it's not super tight to it. As far as the Ned rig goes, yes, almost always it's just open, and I'm not necessarily pitching that in a tight cover. So you get kind of good at doing the bow and arrow technique with a plink in the line or whatever, so you pop the jig out of rocks. So that's something that can be really effective as a learning tool. But it's generally more of a deeper water bait, so I fish it in those kind of slack water areas that are a little bit deeper. So
Great.
mhm.
One I'm not familiar with, you mentioned the Texas rig. Could you dive
Yeah.
a little bit more into that?
So Texas rigging is basically you hook through the first quarter inch or so of whatever the plastic is, and then back out of it, and then back into it after you twist the hook around 180 degrees. And basically what that does is it puts the hook through the plastic and then puts the flat part of the barb area or whatever right up against the plastic, and then you can actually what they call texpose it, right? And put the very point. I know it's there's all kinds of terminology with bass fishing, man. It's all just like everything, but where you can put the point of the hook back into the plastic slightly, and that creates a very weedless type presentation. So in the case of the tube that I showed, it was virtually weedless. I mean, it will still get hung up on stuff. There's nothing that's 100% weedless. Otherwise, you're not going to catch fish. So, at least
They'll
that's
probably
my
come up with
opinion.
something.
Yeah.
So I always like to point out there, all these tackle manufacturers, they're popping out of the woodwork, it seems like, and they're more interested in catching your money than they are catching fish all the time.
Yeah.
So they can promise the
Yeah.
world that they're not always, nothing's 100% weedless, nothing's
True.
guaranteed to catch fish, but
Yeah.
some of the old
I
tried
think
and
that
true
a lot of
ones.
yeah, I think the colors honestly are meant to catch fishermen, not necessarily fish, because fish are not, I mean, I always have to think about, when I give fish talks, right? As a professional, as a fish geek, right? I talk to kids all the time and I tell them, you know what? A big 25, 26-inch walleye, it's got a brain the size of the tip of your pinky. How much do you think it can think, right? So I think about the same kind of thing. Yes, the rods and cones are there and they can see color, but it's not like this great deal of detail that we tend to think about, I think. And we overthink that as fishermen, I think. So
Hey, good point. So yeah, if you have any other questions, um, please put them in the Q&A section there. And Kiger, he's our Northwoods guru up there,
hmm,
the diehard walleye guy. So he's always
okay.
wondering about catch and release and
Yep.
if they're any good eating.
Well, yeah, I would encourage you. I mean, certainly, catch and release has actually taken off throughout the United States, and you could argue that it's probably taken place since the mid '80s to early '90s or whatever. And that's probably not a bad thing, but there's to a point where, we've gotten to the point where we actually have almost excessive bass recruitment, whether it's for largemouth or smallmouth. And if you're gonna eat something, they're great eating, but I would encourage you to harvest only those fish that are about 14 inches or less. Not necessarily because they're bad or whatever, but two things. One is that they grow pretty slow, all right, at least from river systems and for sure. Um, they grow fairly slow, so their contaminant load is a little bit higher the bigger the fish gets. And then two, we have an excessive number of fish that are kind of coming up through most systems, not all, but most systems. So those smaller fish are actually a little bit better eating anyway. And you can also allow the next person to catch a decent trophy of the lifetime, maybe for them. So if you catch a bigger
Right.
fish, you release it. If you catch a smaller one, if you want to eat it, hey, that's okay. So within the limits, of course.
And I will confess, you'll never taste a better fish, even if it is a bass, when you're in the boundary waters and that's what you're catching, because they're
Absolutely.
just
Yep.
because they're great.
Yeah.
I know Ed asked earlier too about advice on Rappler Meps. He is not a big live bait fisherman.
Yep.
And Jeff was asking about, is live bait effective for smallmouth bass and when would be the best time to use that? So
Yeah, so rivers are really kind of cool. Is that if you use a night crawler on the river and anywhere near the bottom, you have the odds of catching probably about 12 different species. Okay, just with a simple bait like a night crawler. I know guys use minnows. I know guys use leeches. I know guys use crayfish. Right, as long as it's caught from that system. And they all can be effective at times, and sometimes it can be even more effective than the moving baits or any of the stuff I showed. But I just I'm all about keep it simple, and I've got the baits there. I don't really need to worry about keeping my bait in fresh coolers or in fresh water or anything like that. So for me, it's just the artificials have always worked, and it's just something I've been effective with. So I use night crawlers on occasion if I just want to go fishing and catch fish. That's the best way to do it, and hit those same eddies and those seam areas between the eddy and the fast current. Put a night crawler down there, you catch catfish, red horse, suckers, carp, smallmouth bass, sometimes largemouth bass. I mentioned channel catfish. Yeah, so I mean, a variety of species, walleye, northern pike, everything can be caught on a night crawler in the river. So
night crawlers are a go-to.
they are for sure.
In one, I like to do a lot of fly fishing and stuff. And
Hmm.
we had this debate too about, there's so many fly fishermen, especially when they're fishing for trout or catch and release guys. And, I was talking to Von Schnook down in the southeast, and he said there's actually sections of water we'd prefer that they're catching some of these mid-sized fish
Yep,
and taking them out because there's just beginning to be an
overabundant.
overabundance of them. So
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
a great point. And, contact your local fisheries office. You
yeah.
guys are the ones that know, and hey, say, hey, maybe this is a good section to catch a couple fish if you're going to be out looking for a meal. So,
Hmm.
and speaking of fly fishing, we'll put in the chat there. We'll condemn him for putting in the chat, not in the Q&A, but that's right. Well, we still got your question. Any experience or comments on river fishing for smallies with a fly rod? I know a lot of guys that do it. I love it.
Yeah, yeah. You've got an awesome opportunity right out here in your backyard. Honestly, if you live in central Minnesota, anyway. Um, the stretch of the Mississippi River, pretty much from, I guess I would argue, from Brainerd all the way down through uh, maybe Dayton, right, has got ideal smallmouth wading water, right? So if you like to fish sort of Montana style, right, with the big casting rod, I'd recommend like an 8 or 9 weight, and for fishing for smallmouth, only because they've got a good amount of power, and then be able to throw some foam core poppers. That's a blast. There's no question about it. And you could hit the same types of habitat. The same things sort of apply. So using maybe streamers to cover some water until you figure something out, and then maybe slow down with a little bit of the foam core popper, or you could use that as a search bait too, and then slow down with like a woolly bugger or something. There's a buddy of mine that ties these flies called Fly of the Day, and for whatever reason, it does seem to be effective, but it's a multicolor thing. Sometimes brown and black. Sometimes it's red and white. So I don't know. But honestly, if you just kind of follow the same sort of pattern, pick some water in the spots that try and hit. Um, you know, palm in the nose a little bit as you go until you figure something out with what the fish are doing that day, because it can change depending upon flows and temperatures and everything else. But and then just kind of slow down with something like maybe like a woolly bugger, or something that sinks a little bit more, maybe a crayfish imitation or something like that. So great way to check
Y-
to get the fish. I would argue that if you want to spend some time, there's some great public access areas along the river, multiple places, honestly, especially as you get up near St. Cloud, Sauk Rapids, ideal for wading and fly fishing. The lower the flow, the better, for sure.
Yeah, a great spot to find some of that information out is on the DNR website at Lake Finder or
There you go.
Streamfinder, and find out
Yeah.
some of those public access points
Even the
too. So
recreation compass is a great
yeah,
all-around tool for getting there. Agreed.
great. Uh, Russell asked a question about the fish that winter around the Monticello area. Are they coming from up or down river about that 18-mile range?
They're not actually. What's interesting is that those fish, I don't know if you noticed, I picked out one of those that was right around Becker, just upstream of the Monticello area, and it migrated up to St. Cloud to winter. We did have some fish that hung out right in that area, but honestly, there was not a huge migration that went from anywhere else, either upstream or downstream, to get to that hot water discharge. So, a lot of people have some concern in that area because there's a hot water discharge at the nuclear power plant, and they think that the fish are getting drawn in. But honestly, pretty much what it is, it's a localized attraction, and then they move towards one side of the river during the wintertime to be favored in that warmer water. So um, it was an interesting concept for sure. So
Great.
yeah,
And Jeff was asking a little more. We talked a little bit the difference between river fishing and lake fishing. How about casting techniques for through runs and riffles? Are you
yeah,
casting upstream and coming down through, or
yeah.
what's your good
Good,
presentation like that?
good point. Honestly, the best way that I've found, if you can manage to make it happen, is casting upstream and then bringing it down kind of at a diagonal, not necessarily straight downstream, but at a diagonal. You get more presentation angles that way. At least that's my personal opinion. So if you can cast upstream to an eddy right at the key top spot of the eddy, and then bring it down kind of at a 45-ish or something, that's most natural to the fish. They're seeing stuff coming at them, going away from them, and now all of a sudden they feel like they have to catch it. So that's at least been my experience anyway. Um, to cast through the runs and the riffles, like you say, upstream is ideal if you can cast to an upstream location and then work it downstream. So if that, I hope that makes sense. If not, let me know.
I think
But yeah,
that's one of the
yeah.
it's one of the big
If you
differences between fishing in the local lake and pitching under a dock versus
exactly,
upstream where you're dealing with current. So
yeah. So I mean, the fish are always oriented, or almost always oriented upstream. The only times I can think of where they're not, all right, is that you have this back eddy or whatever, an eddy that's going in reverse direction along shore. They can actually sit in one of those little areas if the habitat's there and face downstream and not be swept away or whatever. So those conditions can be a little bit different, but 99% of the time, those fish are oriented in upstream orientation, right? They're
yeah,
facing up into the current or near the current, and they're looking at stuff that's coming down to them. So the best way to try and present a bait to that is, going in the upstream direction and then coming across or down. So for sure. If you're looking to cover the most water, parallel or perpendicular to the flow is ideal, right? So casting across the current. If you're using faster moving baits, that works ideal because by the time you cast once, it'll be downstream further when you get it closer to you. So it covers a lot of water and a lot of ground that way, which is kind of it's a helpful way to get onto some more active fish.
great. And Vaughn was wondering, and we touched on this a little bit about the picking the right colors for the watercolor. So
Yeah, yeah, that's That's a good one. I because the Mississippi in particular and a lot of the tributaries can get kind of dirty during the springtime, especially. I tend to use the darker colors, so like the black and blues, black and browns when it's dirty water, right? The more clear the water is, I tend to use the little bit brighter colors. There's some exceptions to that. I mean, the colors of the Senkos or stickworms that I showed were pretty basic, right? So they're, like I said, the black, blue, brown chartreuse, or brown and white, and then white, right? All those I can use during any clear water condition too. It's just that I seem to have more effectiveness when I'm using the browns and maybe white, or the brown and white combo. So I'm just trying to think, what are they feeding on for the most part? Well, if it's crayfish and minnows, brown and white covers that. So that's my that's kind of my thought process here, is keeping it simple, sort of, right? But
Yeah, I think that's one of the keys. You can always buy more gear, but you don't always need it, right?
there's that.
Tried and true,
I have
simple
a lot
stuff.
of stuff too, but I honestly don't use a whole lot of crankbaits. So even though I've got a bunch, it's like I don't throw them that often. So I don't know.
Right.
Cover water. The swim jigs are by far an awesome way to cover water and be effective and virtually weedless. And that's what I really like to use a lot of. So
Awesome. Well,
yeah.
Eric, I think that's all the questions we have.
Okay.
So that was a great presentation. We had several people joining us live, which is nice, and some good
Good.
questions. So if we don't see any other ones, I'd just like to remind people, join us next week. We have a talk coming up from the PCA to talk about getting lead out, keeping lead out of fishing tackle, which is a kind of a hot topic coming up, and it's a great way to protect other species other than our fish. So I hope we see everybody next week. With that, I think we can stop the recording and we'll head back to the back room.